It's April 21st, 1945, Berlin, Germany. Soviet artillery bombards the city from all sides as more than 2 million Red Army soldiers fight their way in. Hitler, deep in his bunker, gives orders to armies that no longer exist. The vastly outnumbered Nazi troops cling to their positions not out of hope but out of desperation. There is no escape. Among the last defenders is SS Unterscharführer Franz Wahlberg, a Swedish volunteer who once believed in the Nazi cause. Now he only wants to survive. It was desperate. Everything was chaos. Everyone was trying to escape. There were burned corpses all around us. Franz would survive the battle to tell his story, but thousands would not. Yet unlike most, Franz had chosen this war. He had volunteered, and he wasn't alone. All around him, men who owed no allegiance to Germany were making their last stand. The French Waffen-SS buried under rubble, Spanish volunteers knocking out Soviet tanks, Dutch collaborators still firing at advancing soldiers. And the Germans, they fought for their homeland. But Wahlberg and the others, they had no territory to defend, no Führer to obey. So why were they in Berlin? What drove a Swede, a Spaniard and a Dutchman to fight to the last bullet for a Berlin that was never theirs? What drove them to support Hitler to the last obstacle? The answer won't be found in the ruins of 1945. It lies in Hitler's headquarters in pre-war Berlin, when the Nazi machine seemed unstoppable. It's a story of false hopes, relentless propaganda and hateful ideologies, and it all began with an organization that promised those men a new Europe, the infamous SS. Nazi ideology and foreign fighters. At the outbreak of war, the German army, unsurprisingly, needed a large number of recruits. During its attack on Poland in 1939 and in Western Europe and Scandinavia in 1940, it numbered around 4 million soldiers. During that period, the Waffen-SS worked primarily as a support force with around 100,000 members, murdering Jews, arresting foreign political suspects, and fighting in battles. The casualties they suffered were not heavy, and replacements were relatively easy to find. Thus, in the early years of the war, the SS still enjoyed the luxury of extremely strict criteria for who could enter the Waffen-SS. Recruits could only be German citizens who could, of course, ironically, prove their Aryan ancestry since 1800. They also had to be single and have no criminal record. Other criteria included being between 17 and 23 years old, being at least 1.74 meters tall and having perfect teeth and eyesight. In short, they had to represent the ideal image of a Nazi soldier. But after Germany occupied vast territories in Western and Northern Europe, conditions changed, as did Nazi policies. To understand this shift, it is important to briefly analyze the foundations of Nazi racial ideology. This racial ideology classified people like a winding ladder. At the top were ethnic Germans and Austrians. At the bottom were Jews, eternal enemies of the German race who were to be exterminated. Also at the bottom were Slavs, Russians, Serbs, etc., considered subhumans fit only for slavery. Among these groups were all other nationalities, such as the French and Spanish, who were tolerated, though not considered equal. And finally, in second place, just below the Germans, were the Danes, Dutch, Swedes, and Norwegians, historically considered lost Germans, and who could be reintegrated into the German race if they embraced Nazi ideals. Thus, with this ideology as a background, and with the war increasingly expanding after 1940 and 1941, the Nazis and the SS had to solve the following equation. First, they needed more SS members to have their eyes and ears everywhere the German military set foot. Secondly, all German men of the relevant age were drafted into the official German army, so they were essentially not an option. And thirdly, and this is the key, some occupied countries, such as the Netherlands and Denmark, remained virtually independent of the German state. This meant they didn't have to officially send their armies to fight alongside the Germans. All this led the SS to an obvious solution. They relaxed racial recruitment restrictions so that the Waffen-SS could accept as voluntary members Germans, Danes, Swedes, etc. And this is how the foreign regiments of the Waffen-SS became a reality. Wiking Division. The first tangible result of this new SS policy was the creation of the SS Division Wiking in December 1940. The SS Wiking was formally established by combining the experienced SS Standard Germania with the volunteer regiments Westland, composed of Dutch and Flemish volunteers, as well as Nordland, composed of Danish and Norwegian volunteers. Although initially conceived as a foreign unit, the majority of the division's personnel throughout its service were primarily Germans and ethnic Germans. Its initial strength reached approximately 19,337 soldiers and officers. It's no coincidence that the Viking was created at this time. It was the result of a direct order from Hitler just as the Nazi leader decided to attack the Soviet Union. And while it wasn't a foreign division in the traditional sense, the Viking became the first Waffen-SS division to incorporate a significant number of non-German volunteers. The most interesting thing about this is that these were not simple recruits but faithful believers in Nazism. The vast majority in this early stage were far-right activists, fascist sympathizers, and anti-communists who saw Hitler's war as an opportunity to build a new Europe. For example, Emil Stahl, a Dane, had already joined the Danish National Socialist Party at just 16 years old and enlisted as a volunteer in the SS in June 1940, just after the Nazis occupied his homeland. He was a fervent anti-Bolshevik and so influenced by the Nazis that he would only leave the battlefield after being seriously wounded 2 years later. The other volunteers were more or less like him. Historian Rolf Dieter Müller describes them thus. They were representatives of right-wing extremist and fascist movements in their home countries, each with a peculiar mold. In most cases, they were small political minorities, social outcasts who, by volunteering to fight in German uniforms, hoped to gain political capital and recognition. Each displayed a unique blend of audacity, idealism, and political ambition. Now, this observation raises the question, if those volunteers were only a minority, could they really form efficient units? After all, World War II was a war of millions of soldiers. Could the SS and the German army really rely on a few thousand volunteers? Recruitment. The short answer to that question is no. By June 1941, more than 6 months after its formation, the Wiking Division had managed to recruit only 1,564 foreign fighters. This was far below its target of 20,000 men. In practice, this meant that Viking was never truly a foreign division. What makes this failure surprising is how lax recruitment standards had become compared to the 1930s. To recall back then, one had to be of German origin from 1800, 1.74 meters tall, and only 23 years old. But now, volunteers only needed to display a few general Aryan features like blue eyes and blonde hair, be at least 165 centimeters tall, and be between 17 and 40 years old, requirements that most Western and Northern Europeans could easily meet. Yet, despite these lowered barriers, the Nazis found few takers. At first, of course, this reality wasn't a cause for concern. Before June 1941, Germany's swift victories had made foreign recruitment seem unnecessary, and it was more symbolic than real. But the invasion of the Soviet Union changed everything overnight. Suddenly, the Nazis faced a war on a 3,000-kilometer front with millions of soldiers on the opposing side. Faced with this, the regime realized it needed to take urgent measures to increase the number of volunteers. So they turned to their greatest skill, propaganda. What SS leader Heinrich Himmler and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels did was cleverly rebrand the conflict from a purely German war to what they presented as a pan-European crusade against Bolshevism. This worked because anti-Bolshevik sentiment was already deeply rooted in European far-right circles and meshed seamlessly with anti-Semitic Nazi rhetoric about Judeo-Bolshevism. These propaganda campaigns were, in fact, vigorous, and included massive public rallies and the formation of symbolic committees amid a feverish anti-Bolshevik atmosphere. Posters and media outlets throughout occupied Europe presented the war as a crusade to save Christian Europe from Bolshevik barbarism and displayed the flags of various European nations united against the Soviet Union. The goal now was not a German empire, but a fascist new order in Europe. This strategic shift proved quite successful. The number of foreign volunteers saw a notable increase, rising from only about 2,000 in June to 12,000 by December 1941. The impact of these propaganda campaigns was especially evident in a country that, while not occupied by Germany, had strong fascist sympathies: Spain. Spain had just emerged from its civil war, which General Franco won with crucial German support. However, Franco considered his nation too weakened and devastated to officially join the Axis war effort. Instead, he allowed the formation of a Spanish volunteer division known as the Blue Division to fight on the Eastern Front. Numbering nearly 20,000 men at its start, the Blue Division alone nearly outnumbered all other volunteer forces in Western Europe combined. However, the Spanish people were not considered racially acceptable to what the Nazis considered their elite organization, the SS. As a result, the Blue Division was only allowed to integrate into the regular German army alongside similar French and Croatian regiments, each numbering between 3,000 and 5,000 men. But the success of this voluntary state-sponsored action gave the SS an idea: to encourage sympathetic governments in Germanic nations to follow the same model. This led to the creation of the first foreign legions. These legions were state-backed volunteer units from Western and Northern European countries that would fight alongside the Waffen-SS in the East. In Denmark, for example, Nazi leader Fritz Clausen appealed to his countrymen on June 23rd, urging them to join the SS and fight for Europe against the world enemy. Similar calls to arms came from the Norwegian Vidkun Quisling and the Dutchman Anton Mussert. As a result of this new propaganda campaign and the new recruitment system through legions, the number of foreign volunteers in the SS rose to 30,000 by early 1942, an increase of more than tenfold over the previous year. Fortunately for the SS, many of them remained devoted Nazis, which kept the motivation of those armies high to go to the front. Many volunteers wrote letters to their families expressing how happy they were to wear the German uniform. Swiss volunteer Benno Scheppi wrote to his wife in March 1941, "Me, why I volunteered. Why, of my own free will and choice, I put on my grey coat and set out on a march without orders, a march that neither you nor I know when it will end, or if the day will ever come when we shall meet again. Have you not felt lately how much I suffered? How much I ached all over to be part of the great sacrifice? My heart is full of pride and joy. The lust for power is not my goal, nor is it revenge. Germany will be won after victory. The tribes of Germania participate in the creation of a new world, and humanity receives a new spirit." But this idealism often clashed with harsh reality. Foreign recruits faced constant distrust from German officers who questioned their combat readiness. Most lacked the intense elite training of the German SS, some of whom had been members of the organization for years before seeing combat. Even members of the supposedly elite Wiking Division were dismissed as too soft by one commander, who claimed that some cried like babies during training. The same commander advocated for stricter basic training and even insisted that the unit would only be reliable with a 2-to-1 ratio of German to non-German troops. As a result, many volunteers were relegated to rear security units or endless training exercises without seeing any frontline combat against Soviet troops. In essence, the reason they were recruited in the first place was lost. To make matters worse, conditions at the training centres were far from ideal. Tor Samuelsson, a Swedish volunteer, observed, "If any of us thought we would reach paradise, we were cruelly deceived. We were woken up at 6 without coffee and given dry bread during the journey. Then we had to work, moving large cabinets, cleaning, etc." Another Swede, Elise Höglund, recalled the strict discipline and harsh training. "The Unterscharführer made us run around in gas masks until we fainted. Small breaches of discipline meant we were forced to do squats with the rifle on our arms, stretched out, or push-ups. Contrary to initial expectations, many volunteers lost their initial motivation." Kaffel Olof Holm, who suffered from dysentery due to the poor water quality, once said, "I don't understand what happened to me when I left home." In fact, many deserted in the early months of 1942. Aware of the problem, SS leader Heinrich Himmler questioned the ideological and military training of foreign recruits, further exacerbating the climate of suspicion and underestimation of their quality. One SS Untersturmführer was so furious that when some volunteers asked him to discharge them, he refused, adding, "I promise I will personally execute anyone who tries to escape." Thus, despite the increased numbers and initial enthusiasm, the foreign volunteers soon faced extreme difficulties integrating into their new organization. Could this problem be solved, or would they be doomed to suffer until the end of the war? Main regiments. Growing recognition of the problems in the recruitment and integration of foreign volunteers into SS formations eventually led to radical reforms that would give these units their final form until the end of the war. These transformative changes were driven primarily by two key figures: Gottlob Berger, head of SS recruitment, and Franz Riedweg, the Swiss-German officer responsible for foreign volunteer affairs. Riedweg, in particular, drawing on his own experience as a foreigner in the SS, identified fundamental structural inequalities that relegated non-German soldiers to second-class status within the organization. These discriminatory practices manifested themselves in visible ways: different uniforms, weapons, and distinctive insignia, all of which reinforced racial hierarchies that severely damaged unit cohesion and morale. As a result, beginning gradually in 1942 and accelerating dramatically after February 1943, the SS implemented sweeping changes to address these problems. Foreign soldiers training at the elite SS officer schools in Bad Tölz and Braunschweig eventually began receiving commissions equal to those of their German counterparts. By February 1943, records showed that 47 foreign officers and 172 cadets from Flanders, the Netherlands, Norway, and Denmark were serving in the Waffen-SS, again a nearly tenfold increase compared to the previous year. Their combat effectiveness was further enhanced by equipment upgrades that brought them into line with regular German divisions. More significantly, Reichsführer SS Himmler authorized the creation of an entirely new division modeled on the SS Division Wiking. This new formation was the SS Mechanized Infantry Division Nordland and marked a major advancement in the role of foreign volunteers within the SS structure. The timing of these reforms was no coincidence. February 1943 witnessed the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad, a turning point that transformed the war from an offensive conquest to a desperate defense. This new reality demanded the maximum utilization of all available human resources, making the efficient organization of foreign units more crucial than ever. Consequently, the vast majority of foreign volunteer formations were established beginning in March 1943, including the Nordland, Charlemagne, and Nederland regiments, which would play an important role in the final years of the war. The Nordland Division represented the first comprehensive attempt to consolidate various disbanded national legions into a single cohesive fighting force. Designed primarily for volunteers from Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, it also incorporated smaller contingents of Swedish and Estonian Swedish fighters. However, despite its pan-German aspirations, the division's core combat elements, including its armoured components, artillery batteries, and logistical support units, remained predominantly composed of ethnic German SS personnel. This organizational reality demonstrated the persistent limitations of creating truly autonomous foreign formations within the rigid racial hierarchy of the SS. The formation of the French Volunteer Division is even more revealing. French volunteers had initially served in the German army through the French Volunteer Legion Against Bolshevism, a collaborationist initiative operating outside SS structures. While this project received Marshal Pétain's personal approval, its non-German character initially excluded Frenchmen from service in the Waffen-SS, limiting them to security duties in the rear. However, the relentless demands of total war gradually eroded these racial barriers. In July 1943, Hitler personally authorized the recruitment of French volunteers by the Waffen-SS after intense political pressure from the Vichy government of Pierre Laval. This change in policy led to the creation of the SS Assault Brigade Frankreich in October 1943, which was incorporated into larger SS regiments, but that wasn't the end. The Normandy landings in June 1944 provided a windfall for SS recruiters. As the Allied forces liberated France, thousands of French collaborationists fled north into German territory. These politically committed men could no longer return home, so they formed a pool of captive recruits that dramatically expanded the ranks of the French SS. By August 1944, this influx allowed for the formation of the full Charlemagne Division, approximately 7,000 strong. Ironically, emerging in the wake of the German defeat, this division would become one of the most notorious and committed foreign formations in the SS, fighting fanatically until the final days of the war. A parallel development occurred with the Dutch volunteers. Originally organized in late 1943 as the Nederland Brigade for the Defense of the Homeland, these Dutch Nazi sympathizers were initially considered by German commanders to be of little military value. However, the Allied advance after D-Day transformed their status. Totaling some 8,000 men, these now stateless Dutch collaborators were redeployed to defend Germany's borders, where they would remain committed until the end of the war. The situation in the Baltics presented a unique case of mass mobilization in radically different circumstances. Following the Soviet invasion and annexation of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia in 1940, these nations suffered brutal repression characterized by mass deportations, executions, and systematic cultural eradication. This reign of terror generated such deep anti-Soviet sentiment that, when German forces invaded in 1941, they were initially greeted as liberators. The intensity of this sentiment was manifested in a remarkable number of volunteers. By the end of 1941, approximately 50,000 Estonians and Latvians had joined German-affiliated units serving in various capacities throughout the war. Most Baltic recruits initially entered police formations and self-defense units under the jurisdiction of the SS, which assumed crucial security functions in the occupied territories. However, the initial euphoria over liberation quickly faded as the Baltic populations realized that the German occupation offered no avenue for restoring independence. The Nazi authorities systematically suppressed nationalist movements and treated most Baltic peoples with racial contempt, considering them only slightly superior to Slavs. The only exception was the Estonians, who, according to twisted German logic, were considered closer to Scandinavians. However, despite the deterioration of this relationship and the waning enthusiasm of volunteers after 1942, the SS managed to recruit significant combat units among the Baltic populations. The most notable were the Estonian 20th SS Waffen Grenadier Division and the Latvian 15th and 19th Waffen Grenadier Divisions, established during 1943 and 1944. These formations would play important combat roles on the Eastern Front, with some elements fighting until total collapse in May 1945. Thus, the recruitment of foreign volunteers throughout the war was an extremely complex historical process with wide variations among the various nations involved. It was influenced by multiple factors, not only ideological fanaticism, but also military necessity and the desperation of collaborators at the collapse of their Nazi-allied regiments. But, in one way or another, it provided the SS and Waffen-SS with a considerable number of recruits to send to the front. But what exactly was the role of the volunteers in the actual battles? Great battles. During the early years of the war, foreign volunteers in the Waffen-SS played a marginal role in the overall conflict. The SS Wiking Division, for example, crossed the border into the Soviet Union in 1941 as part of Army Group South, but initially served only as a flank guard or lent its battalions to other units for specific operations. By 1942, however, it had become more formidable. Indeed, it played a major role in the capture of Rostov, pushing deep into the Caucasus and fighting for the vital Maykop oil fields. But even then, these non-German units remained the exception, not the rule. It wasn't until 1944 that the reform enacted by the SS in 1943 demonstrated its true potential in practice. In short, foreign volunteers were only used effectively for the first time in the final year of the war. By January 1944, the situation in the war against the Soviet Union was deteriorating severely for Germany. Especially around Leningrad, the conflict had become desperate. The Soviet winter offensive shattered the German 9th Luftwaffe Division and threatened to annihilate the entire defensive line. Into this chaos marched the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, a group of the most ideologically committed foreign volunteers the Nazis could muster. Under the command of Felix Steiner, the Nordland Division and the Nederland Brigade poured into the breach to prevent a total defeat. For a week, they waged a delaying action, buying time for the dismantled German forces to withdraw west toward the Luga River. Then, exhausted and bloodied, they fell back to the Narva salient, a narrow land bridge between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Peipus, now the last defensible position before the Baltic states. Units of the German 3rd SS Panzer Corps, including part of Nordland, moved into this area to support the 18th Army against the previously announced Soviet attack, assuming responsibility for the sector from the mouth of the Luga River to Peterhof on December 13th. But their efforts were in vain. The Soviet offensive struck early on January 14th after an intense artillery bombardment, breaking through their lines and ultimately defeating them. What followed this initial attack was one of the most brutal defenses on the entire Eastern Front. In February, the Soviets launched themselves at Narva, testing the newly arrived Estonian 20th SS Division. The Estonians held. March brought even tougher attacks, this time against the weakened Nordland Division and the neighbouring 11th Infantry Division. The Soviet advance in the south was only sealed after 3 desperate counterattacks by Scandinavian volunteers. Then came the assault on Narva itself. The Dutch of the Netherland Brigade bore the brunt of the fighting. Its 49th Regiment, De Ruyter, lost half its men in just a few days. The 48th Regiment, Seyfert, was virtually annihilated. As the Soviets shifted their focus south of the city, the Danish 24th Denmark Regiment took control. Its companies bled dry by mud and snow. By July, the Nordland infantry battalions had been reduced to fewer than 100 men each, barely a shadow of their former strength. Yet they held. The dangerous withdrawal operation in late July required rear guard units, a sacrificial role assumed by units such as the Dutch volunteers. On July 25th, while retreating, the General Seyfert Regiment of the Nederland Brigade was still in Narva. An entire regiment was wiped out in the forest just west of the new defences. In total, fewer than half of the foreign SS men survived the Battle of Narva. But somehow the propaganda machine celebrated Narva as a triumph. Corps Commander Steiner was nominated for the Knight's Cross. General Lindemann of the 18th Army praised the foreign SS troops for holding off 11 Soviet divisions and 6 tank brigades with just 2 divisions and 1 understrength brigade. But the numbers told a bleaker story. The 3rd SS Corps had suffered more than 7,500 casualties at Narva alone. The Nederland Brigade lost 62% of its strength, the Nordland 33%. These were no longer the dapper Aryan supermen of Nazi recruitment posters. They were exhausted, half-starved survivors, sustained only by the certainty that surrender meant execution. What made matters worse, they were often used as cannon fodder, only for German regiments to retreat safely and survive. Elsewhere on the Eastern Front, other foreign SS units faced equally desperate battles. Particularly noteworthy was the Battle of Korsun-Cherkasy, where Walloon volunteers under the fanatical Léon de Grelle, along with Estonian units, distinguished themselves at such a terrible cost that their brigades were virtually destroyed as fighting formations. On January 26, 1944, the Soviet 6th Panzer Army broke through the German lines and, by January 28, had completely encircled the German forces in the Korsun area. The encirclement ended on January 29, trapping between 56,000 and 60,000 German soldiers from 5 divisions and support units, along with thousands of personnel from the Wiking Division. The German High Command organized a desperate airlift to supply the trapped forces, but bad weather and relentless Soviet anti-aircraft fire rendered this effort largely ineffective. Relief columns failed to break through. Eventually, the encircled troops had to attempt a breakout on foot across the final 9 kilometers to German lines. Hitler reluctantly authorized this breakout attempt, scheduled for 11 p.m. on February 16th. The Estonian SS Panzer Grenadier Battalion Narva, veterans of brutal fighting, took part in this doomed operation. Estonian Hauptsturmführer Paul Meitler gathered those still fit for action, forming 2 companies of 100 men and a 3rd company of wounded who could walk. They abandoned all heavy equipment, carrying only pistols, ammunition, and hand grenades. Aware of their almost impossible situation, these men adopted the grim motto, "Death here or Siberia," a phrase that perfectly described their desperate situation. The final conclusion of these important battles was unequivocal. The foreign volunteers had been sacrificed almost to the last man. To compound the tragedy, the replacements sent to rebuild these shattered units were negligible. Of the more than 7,500 casualties suffered by the Nordland and Nederland divisions on the Leningrad sector, only 1,336 replacements arrived. Returning to their home countries was now impossible. They would be treated as traitors, while Germany was clearly losing the war on all fronts. All hope seemed lost. And then on July 20th, 1944, something happened. An assassination attempt nearly killed Adolf Hitler at his Wolf's Lair headquarters. This event would have a real impact on the foreign volunteers, but was it for better or for worse? Volunteers, by name. The failed assassination attempt on Hitler came as a profound shock, especially to the Nazi leadership. Until July 1944, the German army's loyalty to the Nazi regime had been virtually unquestionable, but the assassination plot instantly shattered this perception. The plotters' motives were hardly mysterious. With the Allied forces advancing on France after D-Day, Germany's defeat seemed inevitable, and many officers believed that negotiating a peace had become necessary. However, the plot's failure had the opposite effect than intended. Rather than opening the way for negotiations, it generated deep mistrust between the regular army and the Nazi Party, particularly its armed wing, the Waffen-SS. By 1944, the Waffen-SS had grown to nearly 1 million men and became the only military force Hitler fully trusted. Overnight, its strategic importance multiplied. As the most ideologically fanatical of combatants, these troops would fight to the bitter end, following Hitler's orders without question. However, they knew that this absolute loyalty did not necessarily extend to the foreign volunteers in their ranks. The Waffen-SS faced constant recruitment challenges until the final days of the war. The available German manpower had been exhausted after years of combat, with most men fit for duty already serving, wounded or killed, while the number of foreign volunteers remained insufficient. Faced with the increasing need for personnel, especially in the last year of the war, recruitment changed, with an exhaustion of perhaps all but the most forced or fanatical voluntary enlistments. What before 1943 had been a mix of political idealists and adventurers gave way to the desperate recruitment of those facing hunger or unemployment, especially among urban workers. Recruitment efforts specifically targeted vulnerable populations, demobilized soldiers, prisoners, and eventually even POWs and foreign workers already under German control. Some accounts even mention direct recruitment from prisons and psychiatric institutions, offering military service as an alternative to confinement. Assessments suggest that some Wehrmacht recruits were occasionally forced to transfer to the SS. This indicates that during the final years of the war, the volunteer label often masked recruitment methods that were not strictly voluntary. The situation was similar, if not worse, for volunteers from Eastern Europe, Estonians, Latvians, and Ukrainians. With the collapse of the Eastern Front in late 1944 amid severe personnel shortages, the German command and the SS drastically altered their recruitment strategies for Eastern Europeans. During the summer of 1944, the SS created an Eastern Volunteer Control Office specifically to recruit personnel for Waffen-SS formations. Notably, this office did not target ideological volunteers, but rather members of the SS auxiliary troops, as well as prisoners of war and concentration camp workers. This aggressive recruitment campaign resulted in large formations such as the 15th Cossack Cavalry Corps, which numbered over 25,000 men by the end of 1800 and 41,944. Thus, in one form or another, by 1944, foreign soldiers in the Waffen-SS numbered almost 250,000, representing more than 25% of its total strength. This meant that, in the attritional conflict of 1944, it was these units that were thrown into last-minute defensive operations. Their role evolved to serve as replacements for existing mixed or foreign units or as improvised units for last-minute situations. Things just weren't looking good. The end is near. As 1945 dawned, the Waffen-SS formations of Western Europe were preparing for their final acts in the war's grim finale. The Germanic Third SS Panzer Corps, now comprising the last remnants of these volunteer units, took part in the Fourth Battle of Courland during January. The SS Nederland Brigade, its ranks already depleted by previous engagements, bore the brunt of the Soviet onslaught. Its once proud 49th De Ruyter Regiment numbered barely 80 combat-ready men. Despite these catastrophic losses, the German High Command still considered the corps valuable enough to redeploy. Between January 28th and 30th, as the Eastern Front collapsed around them, the corps was withdrawn from Courland and shipped to Stettin. After a week of transit through the Baltic, the exhausted survivors immediately prepared to rejoin the fight in defense of the Reich's crumbling borders. This desperate military situation again forced radical reorganizations. With the newly formed German divisions in 1945 fielding only 2 regiments instead of the usual 3, the Waffen-SS bureaucratically upgraded Nederland to divisional status, though this represented more of an administrative fiction than a significant reinforcement. The division bore little resemblance to its theoretical strength. Having recruited only 339 Dutch volunteers throughout the whole of 1944, it now relied overwhelmingly on last-minute German recruits to fill its depleted ranks. This mirrored the fate of the SS Nordland and other foreign formations. What began as ideological volunteer units had become cobbled-together assemblages of the few manpower the collapsing Reich could muster. They were, as some historians have ingeniously called them, paper divisions. So, with such a desperate situation, with Germany surrounded and the Russian army advancing ever deeper into the German mainland, one might think that the Nazi authorities would at least try to use volunteers for a solid defense. But you might be surprised. In fact, the Nazis were already preparing a final offensive in which volunteers would be used en masse and sacrificed, Operation Sonnenwende. One last attack. Operation Sonnenwende was a desperate German last-gasp offensive near Stargard in present-day Pomerania, northeastern Germany. The German 3rd SS Panzer Corps, an amalgamation of foreign divisions such as the Wiking, formed the core of this attack force, now reinforced by 2 understrength Belgian SS battle groups and the newly formed but still inexperienced SS Charlemagne Division in reserve. The main assault force came from a collection of reduced units: the SS Nordland, the SS Nederland, the SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, and the SS Police Division supported by the Army's Corps Group Münzel. The SS Nordland, once an elite formation, had been systematically weakened to reinforce other units. Its Norge and Denmark regiments had lost their 1st battalions in November, transferred as replacements to the SS Wiking Division. What remained was a shadow of its former self, reduced to 5 partially motorized infantry battalions, typical of the declining German divisions of 1945. The operation quickly unraveled. Planned as a pincer movement, the southern attack from Frankfurt Oder never materialized. Steiner's newly formed 11th SS Panzer Army General Staff struggled to coordinate the disparate forces, delaying the offensive until mid-February. When the attack finally began, only the SS Nordland was initially ready, advancing alone on limited road routes due to poor weather. Remarkably, they penetrated 7 miles to Arnswald on February 15th, rescuing a trapped German garrison and thousands of civilians. Other units slowly joined in over the next few days, with the SS Wallonian and SS Langemarck covering the flanks, but minefields and stiff Soviet resistance halted the advance after making minimal gains. Although tactically insignificant, the Stargard offensive forced the Red Army to halt its advance on Berlin to secure its northern flank in Pomerania during March. But when the Soviet counteroffensive began on March 1st, 4 massive armies broke through the exhausted German defences. The SS Nederland and SS Langemarck bore the brunt of the initial assault by 2 Soviet tank armies. The Dutch units were again decimated, with only 2 battalions of their original regiments remaining, the 48th and 49th. The Flemish Brigade withdrew toward Altdam and Stettin, with companies reduced to 30 to 40 men each, while the Walloons carried out fighting withdrawals northward. The remaining armoured vehicles of the SS Nordland provided crucial rearguard action, as its infantry, now averaging fewer than 100 men, delayed the Soviet advance toward Stettin and the Oder River. By then, replacements consisted primarily of the last available Germans, members of the nearly destroyed German Air Force, and some naval personnel, further diluting the Western European character of these formations. The greatest disaster struck the French SS Charlemagne Division. After only 5 months of training at Wildflecken, its 4,500 men were caught completely unprepared near Kurlin by the advancing Soviet forces between February 24th and 29th. Without artillery support or supply lines, the 57th and 58th SS regiments were overwhelmed near Hammerstein and Bellegarde. The division fragmented into isolated groups during its attempted withdrawal northward. Colonel Poid and most of his men disappeared in the chaos, while General Krukenberg managed to gather around 1,200 survivors who reached the German lines at Divero on March 12th. Another group of 500 men, under Captain Martin, became trapped in the Danzig pocket and eventually evacuated to Copenhagen on April 5th without seeing further combat. By mid-April 1945, there was virtually only one defensive point where the German army and its SS volunteers could defend themselves: Berlin. For many, desertion had become an option despite the risks, but some still clung to hope. The reason: the astonishing new prodigious weapon that Hitler celebrated, could it change their fate and give them the victory they had fought for so long? The last stand. We knew important things were happening, that sensational weapons would be deployed and that the war would take on a completely new character. We knew even better things were coming. These are the words of Erik Wallin, a Swedish volunteer in the SS Nordland Division who fought from 1943 until the last battle for Berlin in May 1945. Wallin was a devoted anti-Bolshevik who had already volunteered to fight against the Soviet Union in 1939, joining the Finnish army during the Soviet-Finnish Winter War. After returning to Sweden, he tried to join the Waffen-SS immediately when foreign volunteers were allowed in, but was rejected. As a result, he joined the Swedish army but described his experience as boring. For him, it was unacceptable to be part of a neutral army while all of Europe was burning. His chance came in January 1943 when a friend called him to reapply for the SS, as recruitment rules had been relaxed. So dedicated was he that he decided to desert his Swedish regiment, cross the Finnish border, and travel to Berlin, where he was indeed offered a position in the Nordland Division. But even for such a dedicated anti-communist, life at the front proved horrific. He fought throughout the German retreat from Estonia to Pomerania and finally found himself in desperate straits in Berlin. The only thing that kept him going during these final days was the weapon Hitler had promised him. The prodigious weapon he spoke of was none other than the famous V2, the first rocket to reach space and a weapon promoted by Nazi propaganda as the ultimate solution against their enemies. But it failed to live up to such expectations. In Berlin's final days, some V2s continued to take off aimlessly toward the west, finding no use against the massive Soviet wave arriving from the east. The rockets became a bitter joke among the defenders, a symbol of unfulfilled Nazi promises. Wallin's hopes were dashed, and he was eventually wounded and hospitalized. But the rest of Wallin's division continued its fight under the command of Brigadier General Gustav Krukenberg. Krukenberg arrived in Berlin in late April and was appointed commander of Defense Sector C. His temporary headquarters was initially established in the cellars of the Berlin Opera. This headquarters must have been dysfunctional, to say the least. The cellars stank of damp and dirty men. Maps lay scattered in boxes, marked with last-minute withdrawal lines that were narrowing hourly. Krukenberg was ordered to engage elements of Nordland in this sector, including the commanders of the 23rd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, Norge, and the 24th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, Denmark, who reported between 600 and 700 troops each around April 26th. Krukenberg divided his command into 3 parts and received additional reinforcements, mainly Waffen-SS volunteers from across Europe. These volunteers were involved in furious combat at places like Belle Alliance-Platz, battling Russian tanks and troops advancing toward the Chancellery and the Air Ministry. The fighting now took place house to house, grenades thrown through windows, flamethrowers clearing cellars, men strangling each other in the dark. French hardliners from the Fennet Battalion participated, along with Belgian, Spanish, Swedish, Danish, Hungarian and Estonian volunteers. Some took part in the final defence of the partially destroyed Chancellery on May 1st, fighting alongside French, Estonian and Spanish volunteers until their ammunition was exhausted. The fighting for the city was described as fierce and brutal. Erik Wallin described his final disillusionment at the defeat. Our morale had been sinking further and further over the past few days and had gotten dangerously close to zero. SS Oberscharführer Olof Sandström, another Swedish volunteer, vividly described the situation that led to this sense of surrender. It was a horrible hell of chaos. The explosions of bombs, grenades and shells from low-flying Russian planes were the daily scene in Berlin, and in the ruins, in the burning streets and houses, lay the wounded and the dead in heaps, a seething hell of death and destruction that seemed to have no end. Soldiers were dying like flies all around me, and the stench, some lost control of their bladders and stomachs. They were left lying in it. Although all the defenders of Berlin shared the same fate, the number of foreign volunteers in this particular battle was grossly disproportionate. This demonstrates once again that the SS relied on them only as a last resort, which they exploited and sacrificed without a care in the world, only in the final desperate hours. However, some volunteers remained so fanatical that they refused to see this dark reality. A French volunteer named Henri Fenet was one of the last French defenders present in the city, having accompanied Brigadier General Krukenberg. Fenet was given command of the French battalion in Berlin, a battalion in name only, as the number of active soldiers was only 300. The unit was literally fighting for its very life when Fenet was wounded, but despite the wounds that left him unsteady on his legs, Fenet continued to lead his men, even from a chair in the town hall. Fenet's unit distinguished itself in fierce anti-tank combat, particularly at Hermannplatz, described as a true Red Tank massacre. Indeed, the French unit under Fenet claimed to have destroyed 62 Soviet tanks, an unparalleled feat, almost certainly an exaggeration. For this action, Fenet was awarded the last-minute Knight's Cross, the highest decoration of Nazi Germany's paramilitary forces, on April 29, 1945. This decoration, which came just 10 days before the final German surrender, might seem insignificant to the modern observer, but it must have been an incredible honor for the steadfast Fenet. Indeed, as the end approached, Fenet found it hard to believe the news of a possible surrender, considering it impossible, and personally went to the Reich Chancellery to confirm that the Soviet army had captured it. By then, of course, the Chancellery was a ruin with smoke-blackened walls, papers floating in flooded corridors, and the smell of gasoline and death inside its sealed walls. Fenet saw it with his own eyes, yet he refused to give in. He even continued fighting after learning of Hitler's suicide on April 30th. Only at the last moment did he propose to his men a desperate escape from Berlin by clandestine means. By then, of Fenet's approximately 300 French volunteers, barely 30 survived. This terrifying casualty rate was shared by other foreign volunteer units. However, their tragic story would not end there. As unwanted members of a defeated army, members of a murderous organization, and traitors to their homelands, these men would be called to account for their actions. But how? Aftermath. The first reality that foreign volunteers had to face after Germany's final collapse on April 8th was that Soviet forces executed captured SS members without trial or sent them to gulags in Siberia with minimal chances of survival. Faced with this mortal danger, many foreign volunteers tried to hide their identities to increase their chances of survival. Erik Wallin, the anti-Bolshevik Swede, removed his SS insignia and decorations, convincing his Soviet captors that he belonged to the regular German army. As he recounted in his memoirs, "Like other wounded SS men, I began to remove my insignia. I also got rid of my payroll and Swedish passport. The passport was as much a death sentence for me, in the eyes of the Bolsheviks, as the Waffen-SS payroll, because the photo showed me in a Finnish uniform, and it also bore a stamp commemorating my participation as a volunteer in Finland in 1941. Some French volunteers also adopted civilian clothing when attempting to surrender or escape, although this did not always guarantee safety. The SS blood-type tattoo, mandatory for all members of the Waffen-SS on the left arm, became an inescapable identifier. Soviet troops systematically sought this marking, making survival nearly impossible for those who bore it. Only a fortunate few, such as French volunteer Usha de la Mazière, had avoided the tattoo under various pretexts, a decision that ultimately saved their lives. As a result of this ruthless Soviet practice, many volunteers chose to surrender to the Western Allied forces. However, while capture by British or American troops did not carry immediate risks of execution, it also promised no mercy. The SS's notorious reputation among Germany's enemies was cemented during the Nuremberg trials a few months later, where the organization was formally declared criminal. This designation meant that former SS members faced possible prison sentences or worse if arrested by the Allies. Of course, the International Tribunal could not pass judgment on the thousands of SS volunteers under its abstract jurisdiction. However, some national governments did use the verdict to prosecute their returning citizens. In Denmark, in particular, there was a law called the Traitors' Decree that retroactively criminalized collaboration with the Germans, especially those who joined the SS. Punishments included long prison terms or even death for those who achieved officer positions or had been awarded the Knight's Cross. 46 Danes were executed. However, not all countries were so strict. In Sweden, for example, collaborators were mostly forgiven, except in cases of desertion and espionage. Erik Wallin presents a good case, as he did desert from the Swedish army in 1943. Furthermore, 2 witnesses accused him of having served as a temporary guard at the Gross Rosen concentration camp, a notorious Holocaust camp in Poland. Although he was acquitted of the second charge due to lack of evidence, he did spend time in prison for his desertion. Despite this post-war condemnation and the lingering social stigma, not all European volunteers showed remorse for their support of the Nazis during the war. Many remained convinced of their anti-Bolshevik mission and their role in the struggle for a new Europe. Post-war accounts and memoirs often justify themselves, presenting themselves as patriots or idealists who believed they were acting in the best interests of their country or Europe. In general, former SS volunteers have attempted to reshape the dominant narrative in their favor, presenting themselves as patriots or idealists. While their individual motivations and actions resist simple judgment, their participation in one of the most racist and murderous units of the 20th century is unjustifiable. Some were forced into involvement, which is understandable. Almost all had distanced themselves from their SS past. But for those few, especially in Western Europe, who supported Nazi crimes purely out of personal ideology, their deep racism and hatred will likely remain unforgivable, no matter how hard they try to refine and close this chapter of history.